Patiently. Last month was passionately. Patiently. All right. And we come this evening, and we will in just a few moments have the opportunity to observe the Lord's Supper, and that's a special time for every believer. And I had planned to preach this message, and as I was planning and then considered this evening, of course, that we would be doing the Lord's Supper, there's a great connection between these two thoughts. When we consider what Christ has done for us, the fact that, as Pastor led us in his explanation of our theme, considering the fact that because he lives for us, we're to live for him, but he lived for us. Jesus Christ, the God of the universe, left heaven's glory, all the glory that was his, came to earth, humbled himself, breathed the breath of humanity, lived the human life, and died a human death, never ceasing to be God. But God did this for us. He lived for us, and he died for us. And the response of every Christian in light of what God has done for us must be and ought to be that we would desire to live for him. Paul said he was compelled by the love of Christ, and because we're compelled by the love of Christ, we ought to live for Christ. Christ died for us. And I'm not sure if there's a more fitting subject than to consider living for him in light of the fact that he lived for us and he died for us. He gave his life for us, and we have a glorious salvation and the opportunity now in our salvation to be used of him. What a wonderful privilege. The enemies of God now made useful to God, given an opportunity to live out a life and the day-to-day aspect of it, but to live and live for him. We considered so far as we've studied living for him intentionally in the month of January. I really like that. Miss Bonnie said she's kind of taken that as her theme this year, and I would be with her on that. I think there's a need to live intentionally in our lives and living for him intentionally. We talked about living for him abundantly, and then last month we considered living for him passionately. And we understood as we considered living for him passionately that passion comes from gratitude. And the more we're overwhelmed with our salvation and the blood that Christ spilt for us and the body that was broken for us and the opportunity of Calvary for us to come to him and be reconciled, that gratitude ought to lead naturally to passion for him. The more gratitude in our heart, the more passionate we'll be. And we come this month to the subject of living for him patiently. Now, it's not very often that you consider passion and patience in the same subject, right? It's not very often that you would connect those two things, but I do think they are connected in the Christian life. If you were to consider personalities, you'd say some people are more passionate by nature. Would anybody raise their hand and say they're a passionate person by nature? Yeah, we have some passionate people. You have other people that might say, well, they're more of a patient person, or we might call someone patient because we see in them a laid-back attitude, and maybe they are more patient by nature. But what we're considering here is not the personality of passion or the personality of patience. When we look at somebody who is passionate, we would probably think that person may struggle with patience. And if we look at somebody who is patient, we may say, well, it takes a lot to get that person stirred up. Maybe they're not so passionate. But those things are more complementary than they are competing in the Christian life. Because the Christian life is about living like Jesus. We're to seek spiritual maturity, not so that we can put a badge on our lapel pin, but so that we can be as the Christians God has saved us to be, and spiritual maturity is simply Christ-likeness. The more we're living for him, the more Christ-likeness is worked out in our lives, the more spiritually mature we are. We are to produce the fruit of the Spirit, which is Christ-likeness. And the more we're like him, the more we are spiritually mature. And Christ was passionate, was he not? It was passion that brought him to Calvary. It's passionate that brought him to our house. It was the passion of Christ that brought us salvation. He loves us, and he loves us passionately. And in his earthly life, he was passionate in doing the work of his Father and fulfilling his plan and bringing salvation to the human race and exemplifying what the God-man looks like and what is our model for living like him. He showed us that he was passionate in his life, but he was also patient. You know, we were fallen sinners that he was aware of before he created even earth. He fully knew of that. Yet in his patience, he actuated the world in which we were born. He brought about our lives, and he brought about his redemptive plan to save us in full knowledge of the fall of man and of our sinful lives, yet he in his patience loved us. He was passionate, and he is patient, and we in living for him are to be passionate and patient. And I think, as you think about those two things together, that if you are passionate for Christ, quickly that passion will be lost if we don't possess patience. Patience to wait upon God and to trust God and to follow God. Patience which is faith in him. We may be passionate, but quickly that passion will be lost when discouragement comes our way. And perhaps if we are the type that has our patience down, we would say, in our Christian life, if there's no passion there, then maybe we've mistaken an attitude or a personality for what is not true patience in doing that. So passion and patience, they're complementary terms. Let's consider tonight the idea of patience, and I think we will see a connection of that to passion. We've seen in Psalm chapter 37, so we're going to start there. That is the text verse, our memory verse for this month, Psalm 37, verse 7. I'll read it to you, though maybe many of you have memorized it, but Psalm 37, verse 7 says, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass." It says here what patience is not. Patience is not envy. And he says here that we're to fret not. The psalmist was saying, don't waste your time wanting stuff or what other people have. He says it's not envy. Specifically, as he's saying here, don't covet what other people who are not living for God. It says here in verse 37, the one who bringeth wicked devices to pass, Psalm 37, verse 7, that bringeth wicked devices to pass, he's saying not to follow after him and not to covet what he has. In the believer's life, what is coveting? Well, coveting is evidence of spiritual immaturity. When we covet, when we want something, whether it's a position or an opportunity or somebody else's life or somebody else's peaceful marriage or somebody else's opportunities, that's immaturity, evidence of immaturity. It's also evidence of a lack of faith. God, do you really know what you're doing? A lack of faith. And when we covet, we're also demonstrating discontentment with what God has given us. It's evidence of immaturity, of lack of faith, of discontentment. And David says here, be patient, live patiently. And what he's saying here is do not be immature. Don't be faithless. Don't be discontent. Follow God and live patiently. What is patience? Well, we know and we consider that what's being talked about when we consider living for God patiently, we're not talking about a personality, but rather this patience is a fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 22, we're given the fruit of the Spirit, verse 22 and 23. And it says there, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. Long-suffering is interpreted in other portions of Scripture as patience. The idea behind that is patient endurance. It's not a personality, it's a fruit of the Spirit being worked out in us. As we put on Christ, as Christ is exemplified through our lives, we develop and show patience. But I think it's important for us to understand, what is this patience? If you had to name a character in the Bible who you thought epitomized patient endurance, I wonder who you would name. Perhaps you would name Job. Maybe you would think of the person Job. And I think he endured, but maybe not always as patiently as he should have. That was part of his story, part of the lesson God was teaching him. Genesis chapter 37, if you'll flip there with me, we find, of course, a young man by the age of 17. We're introduced to his life, really. His narrative begins at the age of 17. He, of course, was Joseph. It says in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, and I think we're going to find, and I want to make this our study, how Joseph lived for God patiently and how it made all the difference in his life. He lived and he lived for God patiently. Genesis 37, verse 3 says, now Israel, or Jacob, Joseph's father, loved Joseph more than all his children. Let me just say, that's a bad thing. You don't pick a favorite, right, Miss Bonnie? Do you have one? No, she does not. Absolutely not. Jeff's pointing at himself, but we know that's not true. We know Jeff too well for that to be true. No, we don't pick our favorites. That doesn't happen. But it happened here, and it wasn't a good thing. But Israel, Jacob, picked Joseph as his favorite. Now we know he was the eldest son of his true love, Rachel. But that didn't create such a functional family environment in him picking that and selecting one of those sons. But he did. So Joseph, that's where his story begins. And we know, just following this in the text, he's given a dream. A young man, age of 17, given a dream. And in this dream, basically the application of the dream is that Joseph will be exalted above his brothers and even above his father. Now, maybe if you read the narrative, it definitely comes across like he was not the most tactful in his presentation of that to his brothers and to his dad, that maybe he could have done a little better in the way he presented that. Maybe came across a little wrong, but it was truth. That was what God had given him. That was his position. Now, fast forward with me to the end of the story. So we're Genesis 37. Let's go to Genesis chapter 50. I won't spend a lot of time rehearsing Joseph's story. You're familiar with it. But fast forward here, we come to Genesis chapter 50. This is now at the end. Genesis chapter 47, it's revealed, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers when they come to seek corn, grain, because they're out of it in the midst of a famine, and Joseph is revealing that himself to his brothers. Now, they've seen the grace of Joseph, who holds the position and the power to bring great harm to them if he wanted to get revenge. Now we come to the death of Jacob, Joseph's father, and the sons, the brothers, come to Joseph, and they're a little worried now because they're thinking that maybe the reason that Joseph was showing such grace was because Dad was still alive. Dad's now gone, so maybe he's now going to seek revenge. And we read this portion of testimony from Joseph. Verse 19 of Genesis chapter 50 says, "And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God?" He understood something. He didn't want revenge. He says, if God brings revenge or God brings judgment to you for what you've done wrong to me, and I haven't forgotten it, it was a wrong thing, it was a very bad thing, it was an evil thing that you did to me, but I'm not in the place of God. That's for God to deal with. Because I understand something that's going on here, and he goes on to explain that in verse 20. But as for you, ye thought it evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. You see, he understood something. But there's a lot that happened between Genesis chapter 37, the 17-year-old boy, and Genesis chapter 50, the older man who'd seen, perhaps you could say, the end of the story in this response of faith. But I would say what happens between the 17-year-old boy and this account in Genesis chapter 50 is the story of Joseph living for God patiently. He lived for him patiently. Now, we know he was a man of passion, that's for sure. I mean, he had everything he was given as far as opportunity to do, he excelled at greatly. He had it, he did well at it. And you can look at many of the characters in the Old Testament, and they were passionate and they were gifted. And you can look at many Christians, and they are passionate and they are gifted. But what set Joseph apart was really not his passion, for that was fairly common amongst believers, but it was his patience. And because he was patient and because he followed the Lord, God used him in such a great way. Think about Joseph with me for just a moment. We don't know a lot about Joseph's life prior to the age of 17. We know that he was the son of a patriarch, right? Jacob. His great-grandfather was Abraham. His grandfather, Isaac. We know that Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. We know this was a family of faith. We know that Isaac followed the Lord. And we believe that we see Jacob following the Lord. None of these men were perfect. They had a lot of problems, but they did fear God. And for the most part, they followed God. And of all the families in the world at that time that Joseph could have been born into, God saw fit that he would be born into that family. Just as a side note, and there's a lot of young people in this room today, may I say to you that if your parents are following God, not perfect, but desiring to please God, you are a blessed young person. You're very blessed. That's my story. That's my wife's story. We're the product of one of those kind of homes, and I'm thankful for it. It's a privilege. And I lived a lot of my life on the blessings of my parents for their faithfulness to God. I was privileged with that opportunity. Don't take it for granted. You've been given that, and it's a privileged thing. I've lived long enough to see a lot of families that aren't like that. A lot of dysfunctionality, a lot of homes that are broken, a lot of marriages that are destroyed, a lot of extended family situations. There's a lot of mess out there, and for many of you, you look at a lot of your extended family, and you say it's not an easy thing to go together at Christmas time for Christmas gatherings. And maybe on the ride in the car to that Christmas gathering, you have to have a conversation with your children about, Mom, Grandma and Grandpa may talk about some things that we don't really approve of. There may be some language that's used that shouldn't be, or Aunt and Uncle may do some things that aren't what they ought to be, and you have to have that conversation. But I would have to say, and not due to me, but due to what my parents gave me, and what Charity's parents gave her, that's not the case at our family gatherings. And I say that by way of testimony, not as something of pride or that would make me better than anyone in here. I really say that as a way of testimony because that's not an issue for the family I have. And when we get together at Christmas time, we begin together like with one of you. And when we have Bible time or have opportunity to just talk about the things of the Lord, it's like church service breaks out, Or it's just a spiritually refreshing time. I'm thankful for it. And I say all of that not to say there's anything special about me. I say that to say if you're a mom or a dad in here today and you're desiring to have a Christian home, maybe that you weren't given a real, genuine Christian home. Maybe they knew the Lord, maybe they didn't know the Lord, but it wasn't a family that was designed to please God. May I say to you today, don't quit. Continue on in that. I know the joy of that home. It's a big deal. And you can pass it on to your kids, and you will reap the benefits of that. I've seen the joy in my dad's eyes. My family gets together. I want to be with my family, you know what I mean? Because of that. And when we get together, we're going the same direction. Now, not perfect, don't get me wrong, all right? But it's a joy, and some of you know of that. You know what I'm talking about. But we can all pass that on. What an awesome privilege. Continue in it. Follow through on that. But Joseph's family was a family of faith. But if you look a little further at his life, this came up in our small group this morning, in our connection group. If you look at Joseph's life, you might have to say his family in the story of the patriarchs was a mixed bag of faithfulness and dysfunctionality. I mean, it's just absolutely the case. And there are a lot of dysfunctional Christian homes. And you know about that, and I know about that. There are a lot of that. And Joseph's home had a lot of dysfunctionality in it. But even in that, Joseph was privileged. He heard the gospel. He had an opportunity to be raised in that home. And maybe your story is a story of a dysfunctional Christian home. But be grateful for it because of all the opportunities and all the people and the exposure you've had to the Bible, even if it wasn't perfect and what it ought to be. Be thankful for what you were given. And consider this about your life, and this is what I'm getting at in the story of Joseph. Joseph experienced a lot of the dysfunctionality. He had a lot of problems there in his home. And you might look at Joseph's life, and we look at his patience, we look at his faith, we look at his integrity, look at his character, and we would say, well, maybe that was just in spite of all the problems in his life. All the bad circumstances, all the wrong that was done to him, all the issues with his family and his home, and all of that and when he was growing up. But I would say that a lot of the patience that was developed and the spirit of maturity that was developed in his life was not because of, but not in spite of, but because of what he had to go through and how he surrendered to God in the midst of that. And he said, Lord, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to follow you and I'm going to seek you. And in all of that, he saw God's blessing. And we come to him in Genesis chapter 15, he's shouting the praises of God. God meant it all for good. But he didn't just land there. That was growing in his life as he was responding in faith to what God was doing. That spiritual maturity was growing. And it ought to be for each of us. And learn not to regret the things that God has done, but rather learn to see those things as God using them as he would want to accomplish in your life. Regardless of your home, regardless of your Christian experiences, maybe your history of bad pastors or bad churches, not this one, thank the Lord for that. But whatever God may have you've been through in your life or God may have allowed in your life, consider that God has been working through all of this and that your story and your testimony and your maturity is not in spite of this, but because of this. You may not see it today, but God knows what he is doing. He is working all things together for good, and rather than becoming bitter, let's be like Joseph and grow in maturity because of it. And look in faith and say, God, I don't understand the end of the story, but I'm willing to trust you. You're working all things together for good. And let's have the patience and the patience of Joseph. Number one, I'd like you to see that patience is the evidence of spiritual maturity. Patience is the evidence of spiritual maturity. If I had to define for you what is patience, I would say patience is spiritual maturity. If you want to write this down, you may. Patience is spiritual maturity produced by faith, resulting in contentment. Spiritual maturity produced by faith, resulting in contentment. I want to consider those three things: spiritual maturity, faith, and contentment, and how in the life of Joseph these things were evidenced out. We understand that spiritual maturity is the development of Christ-likeness in our life. It's the discipline of the Christian life. It's commitment. It's the development of character. It's the putting off of the old man and putting on the old man. It's the renewing of the mind through His Word. It's being encouraged by other believers. It's desiring to live a holy life, being set apart from the world and to God. And it begins and grows in a relationship. And we know that Joseph had a relationship with God. Look at the testimony of those around him. Look at Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 3, he now is in Egypt. He's in Potiphar's house, and his master is giving testimony of what he's observed in the life of this young man. Look at verse 2 in Genesis chapter 39. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hands. The Lord was with him. Look over further in Genesis chapter 39, verse 21. Now he's in the prison cell, and the keeper of the prison is making testimony. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did the Lord made to prosper. Then over into Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh making testimony of the life of Joseph. Chapter 41, verse 38, says, And Pharaoh said unto his servant, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? It was evidenced by others around him that God was with this young man. He had a relationship with God. He sought the Lord. He walked with the Lord. He desired to please the Lord. And spiritual maturity was developed in this young man's life. Spiritual maturity is a journey of faith and following God through the circumstances of life that God is using, the refiner's fire, the work of God. We know that when we consider the difficulties of life and how God uses them, we know what James says. We know that James says that it is the trying of our faith that worketh patience, right? And we understand in Hebrews that when discussing the idea of chastening, it says at the moment it may seem grievous, but at the end result of it is joy, as God is working in our lives. We understand that in the refiner's fire is the greatest beauty. And God is working in all of that. He was in the life of Joseph, producing spiritual maturity. This was a spiritually mature man. It was progressing through his life, but he was following the Lord. Immaturity, covetousness, shows spiritual immaturity, desiring something else. Psalm 37, verse 7. Fret not thyself because of evildoers. Fret not thyself over those that have prospered, these evildoers that are working in that way. We're not to be like that. We're to seek spiritual maturity, and this young man was a spiritually mature man. Secondly, patience is a practice of faith. They're synonymous terms. There is no patience without faith. We understand that without faith, spirituality, faith in my church, my religious program, God. And I think connected to the key to the patience of Joseph and the success of Joseph and the spiritual maturity of Joseph was his faith and his. And God is the right out that blueprint. What's happening in his life was on purpose. It wasn't happenstance. It was God's working. At the moment it was uncomfortable. At the moment he didn't know where it would end, but he saw God working through it. He was convinced of the sovereignty of God. God is working out all things for our good and for His glory. His ways are not our ways, as far as the stars are above the heavens, but His thoughts are good towards us to an expected, a planned end. He is powerful and He is present. He is mighty, yet He is loving. Those are complementary truths. God is sovereign, yet He is merciful and kind and loving of us. Who is like our God, awesome in holiness, working wonders. Psalm 113, verse 5, Who is like unto the Lord our God, who dwelleth on high, who humbleth himself to behold the things that are in heaven and in earth. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust. He lifteth the needy out of the dunghill, that he may set him with princes, even with the princes of his people. That's us. He lifts us up out of the dunghill. He places us with princes. That's God working in our lives to those that seeking after him. Not in material gain, not in earthly glory, but in heavenly riches. As we're seeking him and following him, he is working out this plan in our lives. He's sovereign, and he's working good on our behalf. Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Who is like unto thee, O God, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praise, doing wonders? Patience comes from abiding in Christ, an understanding of who he is, an understanding of his love and his control, and standing in awe of who he is. If we stand in awe of who he is, we wouldn't struggle so much with patience. If we understood him as sovereign and working on our behalf for our good and for his glory, and we responded into faith with what he is doing in our lives, we wouldn't struggle for patience. We'd follow him. We'd be content in our place. We would respond in faith. And Joseph was full of faith, and he was convinced of the sovereignty of his God and that God was working on his behalf. Look in Genesis chapter 45. He's now meeting his brothers. Genesis chapter 45, verse 4. Joseph said unto his brothers, and I'm just going to be a few more minutes, I'll bring this to an end, but Genesis chapter 45, verse 4, follow me here. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. He's revealing himself to his brothers. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve your posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. He was attesting here in his testimony at a place where most of us would have responded in rage and anger. He was saying, it's not about what you did to me, it's about what God was working. And it worked out to wonderful good on your behalf and on my behalf. I'm hurt, I'm sorrowful, it wasn't right, but God knew what he was doing. And I've just been following him in faith that he'll hold true to his promise, that he'll work all things together for my good and for his glory. And God was doing that in the life of Joseph, and that was key to Joseph's patience. In the midst of all the evil, Joseph maintained his integrity. He stood steadfast, he stood in faith. He did that because he never lost sight of the sovereignty of God. May we be reminded in our struggles, in our times of impatience, in our times of lack of faith, that we serve a God who's in control of all things, and he's working these things together for us. Joseph didn't know when he was sitting in that pit, when he was sitting in that prison cell. He didn't know. He trusted God, but he didn't know if it would end in his death or in his glory. But he trusted God. He trusted that God knew what he was doing, and may God help us in that area. Finally here, notice finally that patience produces contentment. Patience produces contentment. It's evidence of spiritual maturity. It's produced by faith. It comes out of faith, and it produces contentment in our lives. The peace that passes all understanding. The joy in the midst of suffering. The joy in the midst of being wronged by others, even other believers. Joy, peace, contentment. You would agree with me, we live in one of the most discontented societies to walk the face of the planet. People go about their existence not content to save what is intended for marriage. People in marriage don't save what is to be in the bonds of marriage for their marriage. We live amongst a people who go about spending things that they do not have because they covet what they don't have and they live beyond their means. We live amidst a society who is not content with the life they have and they're willing to take it. Discontentment runs rampant. And even amongst Christians, there's a great deal of discontentment. And if we examine our own lives, we might find a great deal of discontentment in our own hearts. And it's evidenced in our attitudes and our actions. At home, at work, at church, with our family, with unsaved people, with saved people alike, we're discontent. And we're discontented because we lack in the patience. We're not living for him and living for him patiently. And we might look at Joseph's life and we think, if anybody had the privilege or would have had the right to throw a pity party, it would have been Joseph. I mean, all Joseph did was good. And all that seemed to have done to him was wrong. Over and over again. And if we were sitting at the table giving him some advice, we might say, Joseph, if you're a little discouraged, a little depressed, buddy, I totally get it. And I'm gonna pity with you, man. Let's just have it. Let's have it out. I mean, I can't believe what's going on in your life, buddy. All you're doing is good. And all these things are coming your way. And Joseph, if he would just been going about his existence like everyone else, just living on his own, he would have been one of the most discouraged and depressed young men you would have ever found. The 17-year-old who had been thrown into a pit, hated by his brothers. Just envision that scene, the hatred that would have had to have been felt, to be cast and left for dead and then sold into slavery. And then to go out there and then to do nothing but good in Potiphar's house and then be accused. And it's just pain upon pain and thrown into prison. Then to interpret dreams for the cupbearer and have the promise he would remember you, and he doesn't remember until much, much later. Ultimately be in Pharaoh's house when he would have much rather desired to be in his father's house. All of these things going on in his life. But Joseph was not discontent. He was not discouraged. He was not depressed. He was not any of those things because he understood what God was doing, though he didn't see the beginning from the end. He saw God at work. And he approached those situations and he judged them as God was in control. And I'm just going to follow you, Lord. And may God help us to do that, to follow him. Look in Genesis chapter 41. And I will bring this to a close. Just Genesis chapter 41, verse 51. Now notice when this is happening. This is happening, he's between the age of 30 and 37, because we know that was at the time he was in Pharaoh's house. They're in the midst of the prosperous season, about to embark upon the drought. He has not yet met his brother. In his mind, his brothers or his father, he knows nothing of them. They could be dead in the wilderness for all Joseph knows. He knows none of that. He's just following this journey of faith and patience, following God. And he comes to this point, and he has a wife, he's given a wife, and he has two sons. And by testimony, he names these two boys, Genesis chapter 41, verse 51. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For God, said he, hath made me forget all of my toil and all my father's house. That word Manasseh, which God gave him, that word Manasseh means to forget. Forgetting. He goes on, he names a second son, verse 52. And the name of the second is called Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. That means blessed. What he was saying here is not that he had forgotten because it was wiped off of his memory. He had a forgetfulness. He understood fully what had happened in his life. But he had forgotten that pain and he'd been moved to joy. He wasn't discontent. He was joyful. He was peace-filled. And he was blessed of God. God had blessed him as he had followed in faith what God had given him. And his testimony here, before he even knew the end of the story, before he'd even met his brothers again, before he had ever had the reuniting with his father and with his youngest brother Benjamin, before any of those things had come to pass, he found himself in a place of contentment. In the midst of what was still his struggle, he was contented. Not because his circumstances had changed, but because he had seen his God and followed his God, and God placed him there. Contentment is possible to the one who is patient. The story of Joseph is a journey and a story of living for him and living for him patiently. Today you may be sitting in this auditorium and you might say, and maybe no one else knows, you're not very happy. There's a lot of struggle going on in your own heart. You've been throwing some pity parties recently. You're discontented, you're discouraged. Maybe you would even say that you're depressed around the situations in your life today. And maybe you've excused it, maybe you've rationalized away, maybe you've seen it as appropriate and even ordinary, accepted, expected because of the situation you're in, or I might find myself in, considering how difficult your situation may be and mine from time to time. May I say this, and I say this to myself, and that if that's the case, we've taken our eyes off our Savior. Now, I'm not saying there won't come times of moments of discouragement, but we find ourselves habitually discouraged and depressed and falling on that slippery slope of attitudes and actions of depression and discouragement. And I understand there's medical things at work. I don't mean implying that there isn't some medical needs with depression and so forth, but if it's a spiritual matter and you're headed that direction, it ought not be and doesn't have to be that way. Look at Joseph's life. Spiritually mature, he had a relationship with God, filled with faith. Lord, I don't know the beginning from the end, but I'm going to follow you. And his testimony, I'm full of peace. I'm full of joy. Lord, you know what you're doing, and I'm just going to follow you. That can be our testimony. That ought to be our testimony. That's living for him patiently. May God help us to be that, to live that out, to know the joy of that. That's spiritual maturity, following Christ, living for Christ. That's faith. And that'll produce contentment. May God help us. Let's pray.